What do you think the likelihood of a nuclear war occurring is right now? We're told that there is no heightened DEFCON level in the United States. To me, based on everything we've been told about everything from the economy to the last 3 years to Afghanistan, I can't put any faith in what our officials are saying whatsoever. So if they're saying we're not at DEFCON 5, I'm inclined to believe that we are at a higher DEFCON level and they're just not telling us, but maybe you have something to say about that. Where do you think we are truly at in terms of our nuclear readiness and preparedness as a, when I say we, I'm referring to NATO, I guess.
Well, unfortunately, I think the administration is telling us the truth. They don't often tell us the truth, but I do think they're telling us the truth about being at DEFCON 5. Certainly, we're not at any more than DEFCON 4, but even there are very visible things that would be happening if we raised our DEFCON level. For example, at DEFCON 4, there you're standing up the readiness of your strategic command and control. All right. So one thing to look for is the TACAMOs, the airborne command posts that would be used to launch ICBMs and ballistic missile submarines at sea and B-52 bombers. They should be redeployed out of Tinker Air Force Base. They should be flushed, all those, 12, 18 TACAMOs, but they haven't. They're all just sitting there. They're still sitting ducks. Another thing that would happen is that in major military bases, especially ones that are associated with our nuclear forces, the public ought not to be, there would be increased base security so that people just can't come into the bases anymore. That hasn't happened either. Our triad is designed for transparency on purpose, so that the bad guys will know when we're going to a higher readiness level, and the American people would know it too from some of these obvious things. So unfortunately, I think we are in this, I think, suicidal posture right now, where we have left ourselves open to the possibility of a nuclear Pearl Harbor, while the Russians clearly are at an elevated level of readiness, for a nuclear war. Because the Biden administration so fears nuclear weapons and really believes that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, and so that they don't even want to go there. Well, in the past, when the Russians went to an elevated level, we would try to match them. The safer thing is to deter them, by posturing your forces so they're more survivable. The ballistic missile submarines should be going to sea. They're not. The bombers should be mobilized. It takes 3 days to mobilize them. They're not being mobilized, and we would know, because those are big, visible, noisy things. It takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of personnel to do it. We can't do it in secret. So I think, unfortunately, the administration is telling us the truth. Maybe here and there they've done some small things like continuity of government type things, so that the president, would be able to, they could scoot him out of Washington if they had to. But in terms of the posture of our forces, they're just on a day-to-day basis, very vulnerable to a nuclear Pearl Harbor. And I think that's a recklessly irresponsible thing to do. I mean, part of my peace strategy was that we should raise that DEFCON level, at least to DEFCON 3, tell the Russians we're doing it, and use that as a basis for peace negotiations, to say, look, neither side wants a nuclear war. You're forcing us to do it because of your nuclear posture. Let's talk and eliminate the nuclear escalatory possibilities that would be bad for both of us that could come out of Ukraine. In terms of our posture, the thing Washington is most concerned about is the imbalance in tactical nuclear weapons right now. They have at least a 10-to-1 advantage. Russia's got at least 2,000 modern battlefield nuclear weapons, possibly as many as 8,000. So it's at least a 10-to-1 advantage. We've only got 100 to 200 old gravity bombs, based in Western Europe mostly. I have argued, as a practical matter, we really don't have any tactical nuclear weapons, because these tactical nuclear weapons are bunkered. Back in the Cold War, we could have mobilized them in hours, but it would actually take months for us to mobilize them today. So it's a very noisy process, and we can't do it on our own. I mean, the United States, these tactical nuclear weapons are based in places like the Benelux countries, Germany, Italy, Turkey. The host governments have to be informed. In fact, the whole NATO alliance has to be informed. And then the host governments have to approve, because those tactical nuclear weapons would not be delivered by US aircraft. They would have to be delivered by German or Italian or aircraft in the Netherlands. And so the mobilization of our tactical nuclear weapons is a very visible, noisy process. As a practical matter, those tactical nuclear weapons are just there as a political statement. As militarily useful instruments, I don't think they have any value at all, really, because there have to be airborne, they're gravity bombs, they'd have to get through Russian air defenses. The very fact of mobilization, I mean, as soon as the Russians, if they thought we were seriously mobilizing those tactical nuclear weapons, I think they'd launch a first strike and they'd take out those tactical nuclear bunkers and eliminate the NATO tactical nuclear weapons. And I don't think we would be able to persuade the host governments to do it. You know, that would really put a stress on the NATO alliance. I mean, can you imagine asking Turkey, for example, to make itself the subject, open itself up to a Russian preemptive nuclear strike for the sake of Latvia? I mean, can you imagine asking Turkey, for example, to make itself the subject, open itself up to a Russian preemptive nuclear strike for the sake of Latvia? Any responsible government is going to think of its own people first and say, gee, is it really in my interests, you know, to get in a nuclear war with Russia to save Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia or Poland? The alliance might well come unraveled as soon as you move to use those tactical nuclear weapons. In fact, you know, that was one of the provisions in the Russian peace treaty. They wanted us to pull our tactical nuclear weapons out of European NATO. I would have agreed to that in a second, because I don't think those weapons have any value. I think they're more of a danger to us than they are to the Russians. But so there's a third of the 6 points that could have been. So that's the situation. The Russians don't have any problems like that. They don't have to worry about their allies. Their weapons are already. Many of their tactical nuclear weapons are already deployed on Navy ships and forward deployed so they could be put on aircraft. The Biden administration keeps assuring people, oh, we know that I think one of the things they're looking for is they're looking for the Russians to move tactical nuclear weapons out of the storage concerns, the way we would do it in NATO. And yeah, I'm sure the Russians have got thousands of tactical nuclear weapons in those storage concerns. I'm not sure that our intelligence is good enough to be able to detect it. If they wanted to hide that from us, to moving them out, I know that our intelligence is not good enough to be able to detect a decision to use tactical nuclear weapons that are already deployed, because they have weapons already deployed on surface ships and attack submarines. So they wouldn't really even have to move things out of those storage concerns if they wanted to make a limited tactical nuclear strike to disarm NATO. And this is one of the things where Washington and I are actually in fully agreement, at least the Pentagon and I, because we're very worried about this deterrence gap at the tactical nuclear level. You know, that the Russians can do all kinds of things with tactical nuclear weapons that we can't do. We've allowed we used to have 15,000 tactical nuclear weapons, and they were as good as what the Russians had. But that was 30 years ago. We've gone on this nuclear deterrence holiday and allowed our tactical nuclear strength to wither away to almost nothing. The only other area where we've got tactical nuclear weapons is, and this was a really bad idea, and I was against it, but it was an act of desperation by the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has continued it. We've put some tactical nuclear weapons on one of our ballistic missile submarines, the Tennessee. It's called the W-76-2. And, you know, it's not a new tactical nuclear weapon. It was a strategic weapon called the W-76. And its normal yield is 100, 150 kilotons. But they took the fusion component out and just left the trigger. You know, in order to detonate a thermonuclear warhead, you need an atomic warhead. And it's called the trigger. It's a small fusion component. It has a yield of about 5 kilotons. And so, it's a plutonium trigger. So it's very dirty too. And so the idea was, okay, well, we've got some low yield tactical nuclear weapons on one of our submarines. And the plan was to do it on more submarines. Okay. Now they're not, fortunately, they haven't replaced all the strategic warheads on the Tennessee. It's just some of them. I think this is close to useless as a real usable tactical nuclear weapon. It's hard for me to imagine a president authorizing making a tactical nuclear strike off of a strategic platform like a ballistic missile submarine. Because as soon as you launch that missile, the Russians are probably going to assume the worst and think that you've escalated to the strategic level. Are they really going to wait and see, oh, it's just a 5 kiloton warhead that's going to be landed on the battlefield? And even if the Russians do wait, the Trident ballistic missiles on these submarines, while their accuracy is geared toward a 150 kiloton warhead, they're really not accurate enough to blow up a bridge. It's going to land within a couple of 100 yards of the target with a 5 kiloton warhead. On a battlefield, that could end up landing on our own troops. And it's plutonium, it's going to have an enormous radioactive footprint. I mean, you could cover a third of Estonia with radioactive fallout if you were to use this weapon in a tactical nuclear war, for example, to save the Baltic states. So this is just another bad idea. It was done in desperation. I hope they don't do any more of it. The other thing is the Tennessee has to be, the Tennessee is not always at sea. It has to spend at least a third of the year in port to be refurbished. And so if you wanted to rely on that, that was going to be your resort for a tactical nuclear strike. You'd have to send that sub to sea. You'd have to generate that submarine, and the Russians would see that. Admiral Richard, who's the chief of Stratcom, who's our top general in charge of our nuclear deterrent, he has described this situation as a deterrence crisis, a nuclear deterrence crisis, and he's absolutely right. We're finally, the piper is being, we're paying the piper right now in the middle of this Ukrainian crisis for completely neglecting for years our tactical nuclear deterrent. It's going to take it. We need time to catch up. We need time to fix this situation. And every day that passes, it must be more and more tempting to the Russians to think about using their advantage in tactical nuclear weapons against us.
One of the things you talked about in our first video that was a big realization for me was this idea that a nuclear war is in fact winnable. And I'm hoping, again, today you can demystify nuclear war, maybe talk about some fallacies like nuclear winter, if it is a fallacy, and just talk about why, in fact, a nuclear war is something that may be on the table and could, in fact, be winnable and isn't necessarily the doomsday scenario that we've all been led to believe it is, because I think there's a lot of people who are under the impression that this will never happen because it would mean the end of the world. But in our first video, you spoke about why this is a misnomer. So maybe you could just expound on that a bit for people.
Sure. Let's go back to Colin Gray again. Who argued, the late great Colin Gray, I think one of the great strategic thinkers of the 20th and early 21st centuries. And Gray argued that with the invention of nuclear weapons, every war fought during the nuclear missile age involving any of the nuclear powers was a nuclear war, and that all diplomacy between the nuclear powers is nuclear diplomacy, and when there's peace, it's nuclear peace. And the way to think about nuclear weapons is they're strategic weapons. Even the tactical weapons are strategic weapons. Think of a chess game, okay? Think of the queen and the rook on your chessboard. They're the most powerful pieces on your board. And yet you might never actually employ the queen and the rook by putting them at risk and sending them in to take a pawn or to take another capital pace. You can position these things to threaten your adversary. And these pieces are so decisive that they end up, the positioning of these pieces, they end up deciding how the game is played. They can be decisive in how the game is played. And that's how the relationship that Gray believed, and I think he was right, have. And so you can actually think of concrete examples. the way Eisenhower, for example, by the threat of the use of tactical nuclear weapons, managed to win the Korean War, by getting an armistice and ending that war, because that's what did it. Or John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis ended up resolving that crisis in his favor because he had a 5-to-1 superiority in ICBMs. We have a stunning example of 45 years of deterring the Soviet Union's invasion of NATO Europe, even though they had a 5-to-1 advantage in tanks and they had overwhelming advantages in air power and in infantry and artillery. Our tactical nuclear weapons, during the Cold War, deterred them for 45 years and kept the peace. That's nuclear victory without actually employing a nuclear weapon. And then another stunning example is the USSR going down and the Warsaw Pact too, both of them going on to the ash heap of history. In the past, in the historical past, rather than go down to defeat like that, a superpower of that sort would have gambled on a war. But our nuclear deterrent was sufficiently strong that we prevailed over them. We won that war peacefully, and all of that is due to nuclear weapons. And those are examples of nuclear victories. Nuclear defeats are examples of, for example, the Vietnam War. You could point to that as an example of a nuclear defeat, because Nixon's humiliating retreat from Vietnam was because Lyndon Johnson was afraid to invade North Vietnam, and occupy the country and take it over, which is the only way to have won the Vietnam War. But he wouldn't do it because he was afraid it would get us into a nuclear war with China. And so that was a nuclear defeat for us. North Korea is every day a nuclear defeat for us. With this little failed state, we treat it like a rival superpower, which it is because it has ICBMs and has nuclear capabilities. The shadow of their nuclear threat enables us to allows them to play an outsized role in the world stage. And look at Iran, the mere shadow, the threat that they could acquire nuclear weapons. If Iran did not have the possibility of getting the bomb, they would not be on the front pages of the newspapers ever. But it's those nuclear weapons that enables them to win in diplomacy and war. Now, those are examples that I think everybody can understand about the idea of winning a nuclear war without actually employing the nuclear weapons. However, what about the actual question of the employment of nuclear weapons? Well, we know from history that you can win a nuclear war because the United States did win a nuclear war. It was called World War II, and nuclear victory there looks like 200,000 dead at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 1 million lives saved because we did not have to invade the Japanese home islands and force Japan to surrender on the decks of the Missouri. Even the anti-nuclear fanatics, even though they may not like to admit it, but anybody with common sense would have to acknowledge, I think, that a nuclear weapons state, can win a nuclear war against any non-nuclear weapons state. Most of the countries of the world don't have nuclear weapons. And so any country that did have nuclear weapons that wanted to destroy them, could do so or could force them into surrender. And the only reason that hasn't happened, the only reason the totalitarian powers haven't conquered the world a long time ago is because of US nuclear deterrence, our extended nuclear umbrella that protects all of these other countries that don't have nuclear weapons. A friend of mine, the late great James Schlesinger, he was the only man who had been both the director of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense. In 1974, he gave a classified briefing to Congress called Counterforce Attacks. It's now declassified, so we can talk about it openly, and I do in my article. Schlesinger described a range of nuclear counterforce attacks that could have been executed by the Soviet Union in 1974, wherein they could have prevailed in a nuclear war. For example, they would make a limited counterforce attacks just on our bomber bases, or on our ballistic missile submarine bases, or on our ICBM silos, or on all three of those combined. And under the worst counterforce attack, where they destroyed the ICBMs in their silos, the bombers on their field, on their bases, and the ballistic missile submarines in their ports. In the worst of those scenarios, the collateral damage to the civilian population from all causes, fallout, blast, thermal effects, is less than 1% of the US population. And, and the bad guys are interested in limiting the damage to civilian population because the trick is to disarm your adversary, to take away his nuclear forces by destroying as many of them as possible, and then hold the surviving civilian population hostage, hold the cities hostage, and say, we've largely disarmed you. You can make a weak retaliatory strike, in which case you might be completely disarmed by attacking empty ICBM silos on our side, empty bomber bases, empty ballistic missile submarine bases, and then you'll have nothing left to protect your cities. Or you can accept the damage, that we've inflicted on you, hold back those few surviving forces you have to deter attacks on your cities, and we will have our way with the rest of the world. And then we'll come after you later. And that's how you win a nuclear war. And Schlesinger, the Pentagon, has always known, that despite the president's mantra, that is so popular in the press, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, is untrue, even among the superpowers. If you strike first and destroy the other guy's ICBMs and his bombers and his submarines, destroy most of them, you could win a nuclear war that way. And the Russian capabilities today, when you look at the accuracy of their forces, the yield accuracy combinations, they're in a much better position to win a nuclear war today than they were in the mid-1970s. Technology has advanced amazingly in terms of the accuracy, the sophistication of the weapons. The Russians can make much lower yield weapons with much smaller fallout content. And there are entirely new technologies that didn't exist in the mid-1970s that facilitate a surprise attack, like hypersonic warheads that can fly under radars, like EMP that can paralyze your command and control so you can't retaliate at all, like cyber warfare that can also paralyze your command and control and might even be able to get into guidance systems and your missiles and paralyze your missiles themselves. And then let's take the last case, the hardest to understand case, which is, how could a country like North Korea imagine itself winning a war against a superpower like the United States? Even that is possible, and that's because of the differences in strategic culture. We find it hard to contemplate that a country like Russia or China or North Korea or Iran could envision nuclear victory because we look at them from the perspective of our own humanitarian values. The Western democracies, the most valuable thing in the Western democracies is the people themselves. The existence of the people is what legitimates our government. So the whole idea of nuclear weapons of mass destruction that threatens the lives of the people is noxious to us. And we are averse to wars that involve high casualties, okay? But this is not so with totalitarian and authoritarian powers. To them, the people are just a means to an end. The people serve the elites. They are there to be sacrificed in the service of an ideology or in the service of the autocrat who runs these totalitarian systems. You look at the Soviet Union, Russia, between 1919 and 1945, they sacrificed 50 million people. That's 50 million dead, not 50 million casualties. 30 million dead on the battlefields of World War II, 20 million purged, in defense of socialism, in the defense of socialism against domestic enemies, in the defense of socialism against Nazi Germany. And those are considered great victories. China has sacrificed even more of its people. North Korea and Iran have sacrificed, hundreds of thousands of their people for their political and geostrategic interests. So these countries can imagine sacrificing enormous parts of their population in order to achieve their goals in a war. I could imagine, for example, that North Korea, if it did an EMP attack on the United States, an electromagnetic pulse attack that shut down the power grid for a year, we could lose up to 90% of our population through starvation, disease, societal collapse. So the Pentagon retaliates and destroys 90% of North Korea's population. But as long as Kim Jong-un is alive and his party inner circle is alive and their ideology is alive, and maybe they've conquered South Korea in the process. They've used nuclear weapons to And even though the area may be a wasteland, as long as this ideological vanguard is still in control, that's a victory from them. From their point of view, that can be justified as a victory. Iran is potentially a case that's even worse. You know, the 9/11 terrorists who all sacrificed themselves, that was considered a great victory by the jihadists. You know, the struggle is not for a jihadist strategic culture. You know, the struggle is not necessarily just about achieving geostrategic aims. It's a spiritual struggle. It's a holy war. And so the mullahs who run Iran might envision if they got in a nuclear war with the United States or somebody else, and if their country was completely destroyed, as long as they also destroyed the infidel powers or caused great damage to the infidel powers, the way the 9/11 terrorists did, that would be a victory. And I'm very fearful about another scenario. Maybe we talked about it last time, but it really worries me. I hope we're right about the estimate that Iran doesn't have the bomb yet. I think we're wrong about that. But one thing I'll bet the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, if they have the bomb right now, they're probably thinking, how can they leverage the Ukraine war to get a nuclear war going between the infidel superpowers so they can destroy each other? You know, I could imagine a ship going out into the Black Sea, an Iranian freighter, you know, run by some terrorist group, maybe doing an EMP attack, you know, over Ukraine, in the hope that we will think that that's a Russian nuclear strike, so that it would spark a global nuclear war between the infidels. Now, this is a future that is facing us that's more dangerous than anything we've faced in the past, because we are looking at a more nuclear proliferated world. It's not a bipolar world the way it was during the Cold War. You know, every new nuclear weapon state that comes on the scene increases the pathways to nuclear war exponentially, not arithmetically, but exponentially. So we had better start thinking about the unthinkable, and we had better come to our senses and realize that nuclear wars can be won and they can be lost. And the only way to avoid that is to think about it, and to think about it from the perspective of our adversaries, of our worst adversaries. We've got to be able to stand in their shoes. We're trying to deter, you know, Vladimir Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un and the Ayatollahs in Iran. We're not trying to deter Mother Teresa, you know? And so that's why people like me are going to advocate for a level of preparedness in terms of our nuclear capabilities that to the left and to humanitarians and to, you know, to average people might seem like overkill, might seem excessive. You know, it may be excessive to us, to somebody who has a humanitarian democratic ethos. It is not overkill when it comes to these totalitarian dictatorships that are some of the worst people in history.
Yeah, I think to a lot of idealists out there, they would say that, you know, nuclear weapons are, you know, a huge waste of money, and that they bring the risk of Armageddon. But one thing that stood out from our last talk that you reiterated here again today for me was that these have actually potentially prevented a large loss of life. You know, I mean, the amount of wars, like conventional wars, that may have been fought since World War II had a bomb not been dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, you know, could have been, you know, far more devastating in terms of the loss of life and resources. So that's something for people to consider. Now, what about this idea of nuclear winter? I mean, one of the concerns with the nuclear war being winnable, like you say, you know, it would be a wasteland potentially, depending on how it went. But is nuclear winter a real proven phenomena?